The immigrants that Trump and Sessions are targeting are largely families, women, and children. And they flee their countries from the violence. Trump and Sessions brag heartlessly that they're going to deport 11 million people. And they lie about why these people come here and also about what they face once they get here. And they try to dehumanize these immigrants, calling them like criminals, rapists. So it's important at this time of alternative facts and outright lies and demonization. I mean, people have checked out the tweets that Trump has got off in just the last day, right? Is just, you know, slanderous, horrible, racist, nationalist stuff. It's important to know the truth, and it's important to act on it. Lauren Markham's book, The Faraway Brothers, is the riveting and deeply moving, sometimes funny and often heartbreaking, never sentimentalized, true story of two teenage brothers who flee a small village in El Salvador for the US. And this book, I mean, it was wonderful to read. I couldn't put it down. It helps us see in a very particular and detailed way, helps us feel the actual situation that these young immigrants face, what happens to them when they do succeed making the perilous journey from their country alone. I mean, without the adult of their family, what that does to their families back home. So anyway, I won't say more about the book because we have someone here who's going to talk about it. But I encourage everyone to get a copy of this book tonight, to put it on your Christmas list for friends. And I want to introduce Lauren Markham, who is a journalist and essayist. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The New Republic, Vice Magazine, a whole bunch of others, Utne Reader. And she works at a school in Oakland for immigrant youth. Please welcome Lauren Markham.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for that incredibly warm and generous introduction. This is such an incredible bookstore. I'm a Berkeley resident, and I just love this place. And it's like a total honor to be here and to have my book among all of these tremendous books. So yes, my name is Lauren. This is the book that I wrote. It's called The Faraway Brothers, and it's about what many of us remember as the unaccompanied minor crisis, as the media and even our President Obama called it a crisis at the time, of 2014. So many of us remember there was like this media blitz in the summer of 2014. These kids were streaming across our borders. These young people were flooding across, and the government had nowhere to put them. These numbers were unprecedented. That year, about 60,000 young people crossed into the United States without papers or parents. That's essentially what an unaccompanied minor is, a young person who crosses our border without papers and not in the custody of parents. And there were about 60,000 that year who crossed. The historic average was 7,000 or 8,000, but that year there were 60,000. In fact, this issue had been several years where this number was growing exponentially. But what happened in 2014 is the government had nowhere to house these young people. They were housing them in former airplane hangars, military barracks. It was a disaster, and many of us will remember, right? We were hearing, it was in the news, it was like being written about, it was on the radio, it was on TV, and then all of a sudden that fall, as sometimes happen, the issue kind of vanished out of the conversation. But the problem didn't vanish. In fact, it kept going and persists today. So I wrote this book. I had been covering, and just a little bit about like the story of how I wrote this book. I'd been covering unaccompanied minors as a journalist since like 2013. I realize it's about 2012, the December 2012. So about almost exactly 5 years ago is when I started. And I had been reporting on the fact that it had been spiking. And so I wrote one story for a magazine called VQR in Virginia, based in Virginia. And I wrote that story and I learned a lot. And then I wanted to write another story. Like, instead of answered a bunch of questions, but it actually created more questions for me. After I wrote another story about unaccompanied minors in the California agricultural system for Vice. That brought up more, and that was published in the spring of 2014. And there was just every time I wrote something or every time I researched, it was like, instead of answering the questions, it was creating more questions. So I started to think about okay, is this what makes someone write a book, right? Where you feel like there's this issue that you can't get, it's like the onion thing, or this kind of you're digging and the hole gets bigger and it's bigger than you even knew, kind of the iceberg. And at that very same time, when I started to be I was just wrapping up my article for Vice, a teacher, and this is in my book, came into a math teacher at the site. So in addition to being a journalist, I work at Oakland International High School, which is literally right down, wait, where's Telegraph? Right down Telegraph, wherever we are. It's at 45th and Telegraph in Oakland. And so right about the time that I was wrapping up this one article, a teacher at my school, a math teacher who's a friend of mine, came in and said, my role is really coordinating non-academic programs and services. And a math teacher came in and said, hey, we really need to do something about all these students who have court dates. What are we going to do to support them? A lot of them are incredibly distracted and they don't have lawyers and they have court dates. So anyways, bye. And he sort of walked out and went to go teach math. And I was sort of stunned, what students with all of these court dates? And so it seems ridiculous now, but while I was researching this issue kind of all over the United States, right in my backyard in this place where I spend 4 days a week, this population, and of course it was, right? Of course it was, if this population was growing all over the country, it was growing at my school, but it was growing significantly. So we have 400 students at our school. That spring, there were 60 who were unaccompanied minors. There had been maybe 2 or 3 every year. There were so few, and that they had the resources that they need, so we barely even knew about them, right? We barely even knew what their status was. That spring, there were 60. By the beginning of the next year, there were 90, and now there are over 100 unaccompanied minors at our school. So there are over 25% of our population. So again, this was another reason that I wanted to write this book, that now I didn't just have this sort of curiosity as a citizen and resident of the United States and a global citizen, but and a sort of responsibility as a journalist, but I was also this really impacted the young people I work with. And we have Sue Ellen, our amazing volunteer, here today. I was very happy to hear from Sue Ellen that actually a student of ours recommended the book to her, who's from El Salvador. So that was lovely to hear. That made my day. So I wrote about unaccompanied minors. So the issue fell out of the national consciousness. It was just gone. Poof, that happens, right, in the news cycle. And it feels like now it's happening more than ever. Yesterday's news is so yesterday's news. So many things happen in one single day, which almost feels like a tactic to help us forget. But I wanted to write about unaccompanied minors, but I wanted what I felt was missing. There was the numbers were in the national debate. There was somewhat of the kind of root causes, but there wasn't that human story, that deep, persistent kind of human story of what were the lives of the young people who ended up coming here. What was their experience like, and then what was it like grappling once they got to the United States with this incredible pressure to find a lawyer, to, in many cases, pay off these tremendous debts that they took out in order to pay a safe as possible passage to the United States. They're living these total limbo lives where they're in limbo between youth, being young people and adults, right? They're young people going to high school and live and into Facebook and into clothes and into girls, in the case of these young men. And yet they're also having these incredibly adult preoccupations, right? I need a lawyer, I might get deported, I have to make money. These young men were living with an older brother who wasn't really taking care of them. So I wanted to know more for myself about what that was really, as much as possible as I could for not having experienced it myself, what that was like. And I felt like that was a really important thing to render. So I tell the story of unaccompanied minors in the United States through the lens of 2 young men, their pseudonyms in the book are Raul and Ernesto Flores. And I'm going to read from the prologue of the book that sort of sets the stage for their struggle. It's a few minutes after 9 o'clock, and the Flores twins are buckled into the back seat of Wilbur's Toyota, lurching through downtown San Francisco in search of the courthouse. As their older brother breaks and curses his way through the flurry and gridlock of the morning commute, the twins' identical faces press against the windows, hunting for street names and building numbers. They are lost. Their messy packet of immigration papers states the courthouse address, 100 Montgomery Street, and the time they've been ordered to appear, February 19th, 2014, at 10 a.m. Sharp, they remind themselves. Every appointment in America, they have learned, is expected to be on time, in punto, sharp. A counselor at the Texas Detention Center had explained this to them, and Wilbur has too. This morning, they'd left the apartment with a 2-hour window. It's important not to just be on time, but early in the Estados Unidos, Wilbur said. Shit, he spits from the front seat as the network of one-ways forces him across Market Street and onto the wrong side of downtown. The morning traffic roils and churns around the Forerunner, now stopped in the middle of the intersection. At 24, Wilbur is now, for better or for worse, for lack of a better option, his brother's guardian. Will you agree to be their legal sponsor? The woman at the shelter had asked in her Tex-Mex Spanish. Of course he would. He'd signed a paper promising to provide for their basic needs, to feed and clothe them, to enroll them in school, and to get them to court on time. In his 7 years here, he'd become somewhat of an expert on the United States and its rules. A rule of the landscaping business, for instance, no work, no pay. He'd miss another day of wages today. New Montgomery, that's the street they've been looking for, Montgomery. They drive past strangers in coats and scarves, carrying briefcases, earbuds plugging their ears. The boys are not allowed to use earbuds in class, but Ernesto sometimes tries to sneak them in. He likes the way they make him look. Cool, indifferent. New Montgomery, New Montgomery, New Montgomery. They reach the end of the street, but the numbers don't seem right. The clock is ticking. Maybe New Montgomery and Montgomery aren't the same, suggests Raul. Who hasn't made that mistake? The twins have been dreading this appointment for months, ever since they were picked up out of the Texas desert, their shoes ripped to raggedy flaps, their matching bodies swaying with thirst. They thought for sure they'd be deported right away, back to El Salvador and all that awaited them there. But they weren't sent back. Instead, they were taken to a detention center where a woman explained to them that, as minors, they'd have a choice. They could opt to go back to El Salvador on their own, impossible, or they could go to court and fight for the right to stay. Court, in front of a judge? They'd need a lawyer, for starters, and the prospect of obtaining official papers seemed absurd. Why, out of all of the so-called illegals like them, like their brother, should they, kids who'd been here only a few months, get papers? It's 9:06. They have just under an hour. Wilbur has plugged the address into his phone's GPS, but the place it directs them to doesn't make any sense. It seems to have stopped working altogether. At 17, the twins have never been to a city before, unless you count San Salvador, which they'd only been to a few times to visit relatives, or Mexico City, where they were practically shackled to their coyote, hunkered down in the spectral underbelly of the pass-throughs. San Francisco looms like no other place they've ever seen. Raul used to picture these buildings in the quiet nights back home, rising upward like ladders, like possibilities. But now that he's under them, they're just endless, indistinguishable boxes. They make him feel, as most things in the United States of America so far do, small and out of place. Now, the boys' faces are hardening into matching masks of dread. When they get to court, what will they even say to the judge? With no lawyer, no English, no idea what to argue on their own behalf, they worry they'll be deported this very day. And then what? The courthouse is here among these buildings somewhere, but where? 100 Montgomery, the twins read on the court paper again. Everything sounds the same. Montgomery, Market, New Montgomery, Minna, Mission, crossing and crisscrossing like the tacky strands of a web. I sometimes don't read this, but we're at the Revolution bookstore. Fucking, Ernesto says in English, like a noun. He had learned this word, fucking, in school. It sounded more raw than the other swears he'd learned. 9:30, 9:35. The numbers keep shifting on the defunct phone the twins use to keep track of time. Another confused, traffic-laden circle loops them back onto Market Street. The big white clock tower stands resolute against the bay like some kind of cruel joke. Should we ask somebody? Raul finally whispers. Ernesto shoots him a look. Who? Who would we possibly ask? The twins don't speak English, and though Wilbur can hold his own, how could he pull over a car in the middle of the downtown rush? He can't get another ticket. In spite of his 7 years here, Wilbur feels just as much as his brothers do that immigrant and illegal are painted onto him like a sticky second skin. They now have 10 minutes. They turn onto Mission and loop back toward Market. We've been here before. No, we haven't. Yes, we have. Look, that flower man, we saw him before. True. Silence. On the map, they see Montgomery Station. If Montgomery Station here, where's the courthouse? Where's the Montgomery Street courthouse? They'll miss their appointment. They'll be sent home. They'll wind up dead. And what would have been the point of any of it? The journey, the debt, all this wandering. Ernesto wants to scream at his brother. How long have you lived here? Can't you find us this courthouse? But his throat seems to have closed up. He blinks even faster, as if to incarnate something better to see. At a certain point, you just give up. The boys know it at the exact same moment, as with many things, but Wilbur feels it too. It's that time, the giving up time. An hour past their appointment. It's over. Okay, Wilbur says. The twins say nothing, just watch out the window as the throng of people drifts away, as they ascend the on-ramp to the bridge. The highway drags them above the slate-gray sea like a conveyor belt toward what is now, for now, home. They won't go to school today, and probably not tomorrow. It would be too easy for immigration to find them. But La Migra has Wilbur's address, too. They could go hide out somewhere, but then again, Wilbur's the only person here they really know. They've been hunted by gangs, by packs of wild coyotes in the desert, by bad spirits, by rumors, by debt, by the Migra, an easy 2-for-1 prey. The twins look up at the sky as they emerge from the Yerba Buena tunnel, which shoots them out and slings them back into Oakland. They've been chewed up and spit out all over this continent, and after all this, just for missing an appointment, they're sure they'll be delivered back to El Salvador for good. But they can't go back. For too long, the Flores twins have been dodging what now feels like the inevitable. In the jinxed maze of their lives, at the age of 17, they may have reached a dead end. So the way the book is structured is that it sort of starts us there in San Francisco, and then we kind of go back in time and meet the family and kind of really we meet the Flores, as I call them in the book, family, who's a family of subsistence farmers. The mother and father have 9 children. They actually have She gives birth to 13. The mother gives birth to 13 children, but 4 of them die very early on. So it's a family of 11, 9 children and 2 parents. And the parents get together and start their family really in tandem with the Civil War. So their family is starting while the Civil War is raging. And as was mentioned at the beginning, the Civil War was a war kind of between these leftist guerrilla fighters and a right-wing government backed by these kind of like oligarchic, these 12 landed families, this kind of aristocracy class in El Salvador. And it really was an attempted revolution. And the United States, this was during the Cold War in the 80s, and so the United States was terrified of the spread of communism that El Salvador is too close for communism or social, this guerrilla revolution. It freaked the United States government out significantly. And so our government provided guns and money and training. We would bring Salvador and actually armies from throughout Central America up into the United States to get military training to go back, and they perpetuated these terrible, horrible scorched earth campaigns where they would just go into villages and kill and burn everybody for suspicion of guerrilla sympathizing, and even just to send the message, right, of this is how powerful we are, this is what we can do. So the family, the Flores family, this nuclear family, is this family's born or begins to be created during the Civil War, and then the Flores twins are born after the peace accords. So the twins are they're born after the peace accords, and however they grow up in tandem with the gangs. So one of the aftermath effects of the war and of this kind of dispersal of people, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans, and remember there's 6 million people in El Salvador, fled during the Civil War, came to the United States, and there are many young, disaffected Salvadorans living in cities and towns, but largely cities throughout the United States. And so MS-13, this gang that now Trump and Sessions like to talk a lot about, was actually born in LA. It was sort of it was created mimicking gangs in Los Angeles. And then once these young people were put in jail, they were deported back to El Salvador and imported the gangs with them. So the family is created during the family starts during the Civil War, and then the twins come of age with the rise of the gangs. And so I wanted to kind of show the extent to which this family, who's these subsistence farmers, peaceful people trying to live their lives, trying to do the best they can for their family, are sort of caught up in not wave one, but in the context of this book, wave one of this civil war, this geopolitical catastrophe, and then this sort of geopolitical catastrophe, wave two of the gangs. And it sort of also shows like the churn that people leave and then they come back and then they leave and they're deported back. And that sort of seems to be an endless cycle of immigration here. I want to read a small, so we go back in time and kind of meet the family and then catch up with the kind of narrative of what brings them in. They have to leave. They get on the wrong side of a bad guy in their town. They have to leave first one twin brother, and then because the second brother, because he looks exactly like his twin, also has to follow close behind. So the book follows their journey to the United States, and then about halfway through we kind of catch up with that moment in San Francisco. In between each chapter about the Flores twins and their family, I have these shorter interstitial chapters that are these kind of like close vignettes that do a little bit of work, or the goal is that they do a little bit of work talking about the context of violence and also the kind of these stations along the immigration trail. And the idea is that they're sort of like zooming out a little bit. They're actually these really closely told scenes, but they're zooming out a little bit from the twin story, because I realized that we need a lot more information to make sense of this than actually the twins had, right? They didn't have a lot of information about what the geopolitical context of their flight was. They just knew that they were in danger and they had to go. So I'm going to read one now. Let me see. I can't decide which one. I'm going to read one now. So we're like, we talked about San Francisco and sort of we saw in the last chapter kind of the challenges that these young people are facing once they're in the United States. I'm going to now read a little bit about the kind of context of violence that's happening in El Salvador. So this is one of those interstitial chapters, and it's called The Missing. Enter the examination room in San Salvador's Instituto de Medicina Legal, where a masked doctor cuts into a new corpse. Oh, I should say, this takes place in a morgue, and it's a little gory and upsetting, so if you need to step out, no problem. After determining the cause of death, he'll slide the body back into the freezer. Sorry, he being the, I skipped a line, the masked doctor, will slide the body back into the freezer until someone comes to identify the remains. If no one comes, which sometimes happens, it's too far, or the family doesn't have the money, or the deceased doesn't have a family, or the circumstances of the murder are such that it's best for the next of kin to lie low, the body will be incinerated. But any corpse in San Salvador that has gone undiscovered long enough, decomposing in a cornfield, say, or cast into the dump, is taken to the Department of Forensic Anthropology. Here, some of the skeletons are old and weather-worn, turning the color of rust. The anthropology room is antiseptic, it's all right angles and order. Metal examination tables gleam, and file boxes are stacked atop the counters and tables and floor. Like puzzle masters, the anthropologists turn over the contents of each and fit the pieces together to figure out how a human being turned into a box of bones. The older ones, the color of rust, look as though they would flake at the touch. These bones were exhumed from the site of the 1981 massacre of El Mozote during El Salvador's Civil War. And that beautiful book, beautiful, horrifying, but excellently done book, Massacre of El Mozote by Mark Danner, is highly recommended. When government troops stormed a suspected guerrilla haven and slaughtered more than 900 men, women, and children. Some they killed with guns and machetes, others they corralled into the town church, then set it on fire. This skeleton here, laid out on the paper, strewn with bits of the El Mozote soil mixed with the dust of his own bones, was a man, in his 30s, one anthropologist estimated, a farmer most likely. The bones on the neighboring table, sturdier and whiter and in far fewer pieces, are from a newer war, a war more elusive and harder to track, the gang war. This one here came from a clandestine grave in San Salvador, a pit behind a San Salvador slum. She'd been a young woman, they estimated about 17, killed within the last year. Based on markings inside her pelvis, she'd once given birth. In front of her skull, just above where the girl might have tweezed her brows or dusted a shimmer of shadow, was a splintered hole. A heavy object, the anthropologist says, running her fingers along the breach. Last week, a man came in with 37 bullets, recalled a morgue administrator. 37. Can you imagine? They cut a neat rectangle out of the young woman's femur for DNA. It's hard to know who the particular killers in this new war are. Most homicides, especially the mass graves, like the one from which the young mother was pulled, are known to be the work of the gangs. Yet around 95% of crimes in the Northern Triangle go uncharged. To report a mass grave or denounce a gang member for murder carries a near certain death sentence for the accuser and often for his or her family too. So people keep coming, the bodies pile up. At the front gate of the morgue, a woman is quietly crying, shoulders quaking as she presses a tissue beneath an eye. She leans into a young man, her son perhaps, who wears a stiff expression behind aviator sunglasses. The armed guards notice, then they turn away. A different woman enters the gate. "I'm here to register a disappeared," she says, like a question. She signs her name into the tattered logbook, and the guard points to where to go with one hand, holding his gun in the other. If your police haven't found the person you're looking for, you go to the morgue to make another report. The Instituto de Medicina Legal staff affixes the photograph to a wall along with dozens of others. They hang beneath a plastic cover. These photographs will be kept on this billboard for 2 months, depending on space, the sign explains. It's late July. April's disappeared have just been taken down. Thank you for your attention, the sign concludes. A police truck pulls into the compound, and 2 officers clad in boots and balaclavas hop out to escort a scowling young man, no more than 16 or 17. He is handcuffed, his hair is gelled into spikes, and he sports low-sagging shorts, barely laced high-top sneakers, and a bright red t-shirt. The police move him roughly toward one of the doors. "A gangster," someone says after he passes. "They get a psychological evaluation here," the guard explains, before going to jail. The courts are so backed up that this young man could be in jail for weeks, months, even years before a trial. Thus he, too, becomes one of San Salvador's missing. So I read this for a couple reasons. I like reading this for a couple reasons. One, it sort of talks about that like historical link of the previous violence and the current violence, and to me that the sort of like symbolism of like this corpse from the, you know, that's just now exhumed from this historical atrocity that has not yet been fully reckoned with, although there are trials now going on, and they're trying to sort of do kind of like a truth and reconciliation. They're trying, and they're trying to bring murderers to justice and all of that. But this idea of this corpse from the 80s right next to this sort of new death sort of shows that link really clearly and sort of astoundingly between the violence of yesterday and the violence of today. And it also just shows the extent of the violence, that there's this young woman, 17, her body's just cast into a dump. And there are these clandestine graves, these like, they're like mass graves, but they call them cementerios clandestinos, which is like hidden graves or clandestine graves, kind of. Although I don't know, someone maybe, I've never heard an excellent translation. It seems like one of those specific terminologies for a specific set of horrors that like doesn't kind of compute, right, and doesn't totally translate. But like I say here, if you report a murder that you've seen, or you report one of these graves, you yourself are at risk of being killed. So the violence is endemic. El Salvador has one of the highest murder rates in the world. So it's sort of like, yeah, no wonder so many people are leaving, right? It's also important, though, that to note that it's young people who are the victims of these these murders. Right? Young people are the ones getting killed. Young people are the ones being recruited into gangs. They're being recruited into gangs by force. If you don't join the gang, we'll kill you. We'll rape you. We'll rape your sister. We'll kill your mother. We know where you live, right? Or by force of circumstance. There's no food on your table. You live in an abusive household. Your mother is not able-bodied and is unable to work, and so you have to make some kind of money for yourself. So young people are recruited into these gangs by force or force of circumstances, and I have to say, working with teenagers all day, like that holding a person who's so young accountable for these crimes that they're committing, when it's sort of like both the global political and societal apparatus that's kind of setting the stage for these young people to have so few other options. Like, I'm just sort of not, when this young person who's sort of escorted at the end, I was kind of like astounded. He looked like he could be one of my students who was just being brought to the principal's office for, telling someone to fuck off or something like that. Like he he was so young, and yet the stakes were so high for him. And I have no idea what he did or if he did anything at all, right? We don't know. But that the extent to which this entire situation in El Salvador is a war on youth that was like very palpable to me every time I went down there, that the police target youth because there's an assumption that young people, that young men, especially like young men who dress cool, are involved in gangs. There's actually a law called agrupación ilícita, or illicit congregating, meaning that if, I can't remember if it's two or more or three or more people are hanging out on the corner together, you can just arrest them by mere suspicion of doing something bad. And so what do young people want to do? They want to hang out in groups, of course. But so like young people can't be outside because they're afraid of the gangs, and also they're afraid of the police who are going after the gangs. And in fact, especially toward the end of my research, many of the young people who I talked to, like especially like along the migrant route, they were telling me like that actually they had more fear of the police than the gangs. And the police have in El Salvador, they've instituted like several iterations of iron fist campaigns or mano dura campaigns. And especially recently, there have been some high profile ones, I guess in the past year or so, of these that's always hard for me to say, extrajudicious killings, where they're just these like massacres of people who turned out not to be gangsters. And also, even if they were, like, you can't just go somewhere and kill a bunch of people, right? Like that just like as the police, like, or as anybody, you can't do that. So I guess I read this and I talk about these issues to show, like, yes, no wonder, it is no wonder why so many young people are leaving home. And in fact, migration of adults, unauthorized migration of adults into the United States is at historic lows in the past several decades, where it's the young people who are coming in such high numbers. And we see why. I want to read one more short section just to kind of give a sense of the migrant trail, which was just astounding. I'm writing another story separate, but I was in Chiapas a couple weeks ago, and even now, I was somewhere at 7 a.m. I got there early. It's this immigration station where people line up in southern Mexico, and it didn't even open till 9. There were 80 people in that line at 7 a.m, all Central Americans, all waiting to get this. It's like not worth talking about what they were waiting for, but they're all migrants on their way north. In this one tiny station in the middle, in like a small town in Chiapas. So it's this problem is persisting. So I'm going to read, I have to find it first. Okay. Just a section from actually a migrant shelter in that same town in Tapachula, Mexico, which is in Chiapas, close to the border. In the heavy heat of the southern Mexico summer in Tapachula, a family of 3 from Honduras sits outside the Belén migrant shelter, lounging on the rocks that form a low perimeter around the front lawn. The father has his shirt off. He perches on a rock and leans against the flat incline of another, hands above his head. Papi, his 9-year-old daughter screeches and jumps onto his outstretched legs. Careful, girl, he says, scooping her up. She curls up on his lap while her mother, fair-skinned and tired-looking, settles heavily onto an adjacent rock. My feet hurt, says the girl cheerily and rubs them. It was a long walk. The night before last, the 3 of them tramped over 25 miles from where they crossed the Mexican-Guatemalan border, determined to make it to Belén, one of the southernmost shelters in Mexico, before stopping. There, they had heard, they would find lodging, food, and travel tips, where the newest immigration and police checkpoints were, where rapes and robberies had been reported, what new routes migrants were taking through the mountains. None of the intel was a sure bet, but it would be something to go on at least. Shelters like Belén are safe houses run by nonprofits that string north through Mexico along the migrant trail like an underground railroad. Although it's not really as underground as like the Underground Railroad in the United States was. According to an agreement between the immigration forces and immigrant advocates, officials leave the shelters alone. The girl's mother hunches over her to brush her hair. She is just getting over chikungunya, the virus that is spreading like a full-bodied rash through Latin America, having mysteriously made its way from Asia to the Caribbean several years ago. The fevers and aches are subsiding, though she's still sore, particularly after that long walk, and swollen. The edema plumps her skin, such that when her daughter pokes her arm or her thigh, the tissue stays indented like a putty. It's nice to rest a little while before moving on again. Nearby, a drunken, glassy-eyed Salvadoran stumbles around, showing off a stack of papers that proves, he insists, that he deserves asylum in the United States. Reclining a few rocks over is a man in his mid-30s, tattooed and shirtless. He used to live in the U.S., but was deported. Credit card fraud. Bad boy, he says in English, raising his eyebrow. He'd once had a green card, a high school diploma, a family, kids. When he was caught, he spent a few years in prison before being deported back to El Salvador. You can't even go outside there, he says, because of the gangs. Having spent so much time away, he is now a desconocido, an unknown, and outsiders make the maras or gangs suspicious, especially tough-looking guys like him. I can't live there, he says. Then, tranquilo, to the drunk man, take it easy. Any day on the road north, he continues, you know you might die. The 9-year-old tires of the scene and heads back into the building, where a trio of adults from El Salvador, a sister, her brother, and her brother's wife, crouch on the tile floor, sorting their belongings. The girl plops cross-legged on the floor among their piles of clothes. The women, one skinny, one heavy-set with a deep scar on her temple, both of them mothers, dote on the girl, distracting her from her worn-out mom. The skinny one hands the girl a plate with a tamale fresh from the shelter's kitchen. The girl unfolds the banana leaves and steam spills up toward her face. Across from her hangs a map of North America outlining distances north from Tapachula. Houston, 2,930 kilometers. New York, 4,375 kilometers. Los Angeles, 4,025. The Hondurans and the Salvadorans decide to travel from Tapachula together. They'll set out first thing tomorrow morning, moving north until the Salvadorans split west. They're heading for Baja, not the States. It's too dangerous up that way, they say. Too many people getting nabbed and sent back to El Salvador. In Baja, they have a friend who has a friend who might have some work for them. More and more migrants like them are opting to stay in Mexico. The woman with the scar places her belongings into piles. Things to bring on the road and things to mail ahead to Baja. They shopped for supplies before they left El Salvador, and now they realize they've brought too much. A big blue plastic urn full of beans, for example, it's way too heavy. The migrant shelters have food, and if they get desperate, they can buy beans on the road. A sweater and a clean pair of pants are tossed into the keep pile. Leggings and a satin bra with the tag still attached are stacked alongside the urn of beans. When she gets to Baja, assuming she makes it, she'll have fresh clothes waiting for her there. That'll be nice. She places a jar of cream on the keep pile, foot balm to soothe the blisters and cracks. They plan to hit the road early tomorrow. They'll travel on buses until a checkpoint comes into view, when they'll disembark and skirt the main thoroughfares on foot. These new checkpoints push people like them into territory where their risk of encountering exploitation and violence is greater. And I should say the new checkpoints that I'm talking about were funded by the United States in order to curb migration in Chiapas, so that, in Mexico, but Chiapas is the most strategic zone because it's like the narrowest part. So these checkpoints were funded by our tax dollars. These new checkpoints push people like them into territory where the risk of encountering exploitation and violence is greater. Above them on the shelter wall hangs a bulletin board tacked full of photographs of missing people and of bad guys, rapists, thieves, con men who pretend to be coyotes. The little girl has picked the banana leaves clean of tamale. You know how I went to the United States once, she shouted. We walked. She speaks as if she's on stage. We went to Texas. It was really beautiful, full of snow. I walked there when I was tiny, just a little kid. The women laugh and shake their heads. You went all the way there when you were little, one says, rolling up a pair of pants and pushing them to the bottom of the backpack. I went with my grandparents, said the girl. My parents have never been before, but I have, so I'm not scared. She is writing the fairy tale as she goes along. And then we came back. Why did you come back? The woman asks. We walked, she replies. The women look at each other. No creo, one mouths. I don't think so. The foot cream sits atop the pile of keepers. The girl snatches the jar, pulls off her pink tennis shoes and thin white socks, and unscrews the lid. She dips her fingertips into the cool white cream, thick like a custard, and begins rubbing it onto her soles. It's going to be a lot of walking, the girl says, but I'm really strong. She reaches for the jar again, and the women wince. They seem about to say something. They'll need this cream later, but they let her take it anyway. So the context, like the situation in El Salvador is incredibly challenging. that as I've worked in immigration in the Bay Area actually for 11 years at this point, and a little over 11 years, and I know that it's very rare that someone leaves their home when there isn't a really good reason. And in El Salvador right now, there are really good reasons to leave home. And if you ask the majority of the young people, certainly the young people I wrote about, and the majority of the young people that I work with and that Sue Ellen works with at the school, they would say, yeah, of course I'd rather be home with my mom. Of course I'd rather be living a life, that like the life in, that, like they didn't come here for this idea of like this gilded American dream, although that was certainly in their mind. I think there's a rude awakening for a lot of people, and certainly these young men when they came here about what life here was really like. But they were pushed out. The vast majority of people who are coming from the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, are really feel pushed out by the circumstances at home. The migrant trail is incredibly harrowing and dangerous. It is the young men I write about, the Flores twins, their parents paid for them to have coyotes to shepherd them here. That too was a really dangerous journey, even with a coyote. And they took out a debt of $7,000 per kid, so $14,000, at an incredibly predatory interest rate that at a certain point climbed to over $22,000, even though they'd been paying in installments. It was just like I could never figure. I was dying to figure out, but what is the interest rate? And they couldn't even tell me, right? Like the family didn't even know. They just signed whatever it was because they needed the money. So the circumstances in El Salvador are hard. The journey is hard. And then once they get here, it's incredibly difficult. And so I think that when we think about immigration and like the immigration from Central America today, it's important to hold in mind like that sort of every single leg of the journey and the beginning and the destination are incredible hardships. And so it speaks to the resiliency of the people taking these journeys and also the dire circumstances that they're in. So I'm going to leave it there and let's see if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks so much. Or comments or whatever.
Raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Fancy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you started.
Raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
I mean, just what you read is really beautiful.
Thank you.
And
Thanks so much.
infuriating. And,
Yeah.
So you started writing this before the Trump-Pence regime.
Yes.
And now we have the repeal of TPS. And I have a friend I work with who's actually did a lot of support work during the Civil War here in the U.S., but went back and just told me the story about going into the prisons in El Salvador and dressing up like a nun in order to document the conditions of the political prisoners.
Very cool.
There. But she was telling me she's from El Salvador, and in the Salvadoran community in LA where she works, there's people who are pretending not to be Salvadoran, they're pretending to be Mexican, and they're not shopping in their Salvadoran stores, they're not shopping, they're not eating at the restaurants.
It's really interesting.
Because if they get deported, they don't want to be deported back to El Salvador. So how did this change? I mean, this was already a horror.
Yeah, absolutely. How has this impacted? Yeah, absolutely. People are afraid. I have students. It's like amazing how dumb I can be, or like once you learn, you're like, oh, that was so dumb of me. But I had a student once. He's no longer a student at Oakland International, but he was saying. He's from El Salvador, and then some other kids were in my office who were from El Salvador, and I said, oh, you guys are all from El Salvador, and the two other kids said to this one young man, like, oh, you're from El Salvador, where are you from? And he said, oh, I'm from La Libertad. And I was like, no, you're not, you're from such and such. And he was like, and then sort of something else happened, and later he was like, I don't actually want people to know where I'm from. Like, and I was like, sorry, and I've been researching this, and it seemed to me, in this benign context of the school, the fear of sort of like whatever happened at home was bad enough that like he doesn't want to be linked back to that place. I also, so I think that people aren't shopping in stores and aren't saying they're Salvadoran, both because they don't want to be deported back, but also because there's like fear and paranoia, and rightfully so, of like who's listening and who's who, and the guys who were looking for me in El Salvador, like if they find out where I am, like could something happen to me? And then this issue of being deported back, absolutely. When I was just in Chiapas in this trip I was just mentioning, I was talking to this man who's a fisherman, and he had left El Salvador literally overnight. Like, these young men don't quite leave overnight. This man like packed up his stuff and left overnight because he told me, he's like, the problem is they were targeting my daughter, and the problem with my daughter is she's really pretty, you know? So like, it's like as if having a pretty daughter is this like liability because they were trying to take her as property essentially of the gang. So they left overnight, and he was saying, nope, we're staying in Mexico for a while. We're going to apply for asylum here, and then we're going to go to the United States, because if we are deported back, we cannot be deported back to El Salvador. We have to be deported back to Mexico. So there's you know, a plan. They have a plan so that legally speaking, they can't be deported back, which is so intense. That man was like a very affecting. Heard a lot of stories, and his was very affecting. And in terms of how the Trump-Pence regime started, so actually right when I was going on that trip, I was on BART, and I got a call from Raul, one of the brothers in this book, and he texted me actually. He said, "I really need to talk to you. Can you call me? I have a question." I was like, "Yeah, of course." I called him, and he was like, they said, dicen, right, like they said, who's they, that they're taking away all the papers. Is that true? That they're taking away all our papers? And I suspect that was the TPS rumor, but it just like the way it percolated, and they don't have TPS. They tried to get, I'm not going to spoil it, but they work really hard to get papers. They don't have TPS. But I think that like launched this set of rumors of like, is it true that I'm at risk, or that our brother's at risk, or et cetera, et cetera. So I could not believe, of course, that I think many of us were stunned. Someone who was not stunned was Raul Flores from this book. He was not stunned that Donald Trump was elected. He was calling that for weeks, months. And I was like, oh my gosh, you always think the worst. Every time, like you always think the worst. He's like, watch. And I told him in that same conversation, actually, I'm like, the best part is when I get to talk at bookstores about how you were right and everyone else was wrong. He's like, I was like, how did you know? You know, that everyone wants to know how you knew. And he was like, premonition, I just knew, you know. But what he really says is also like he understood the racism in a deeper way. Like he felt it, he saw it, he experienced it, and he was an outside, right? Like he was a newcomer, and he sort of saw this all at work. So yes, the Trump administration has made this has the level of insecurity that I sort of like try to evoke, and that was present for them in that car, that first moment in the book in San Francisco. That's on steroids now, right? Like people had reasons to be afraid before, and now they're so afraid. There are rumors, there are raid rumors all the time. I wrote another article about raid rumors that like there actually haven't been that many raids in California, but there are rumors all the time. Like there's a raid at Walmart, there's a raid at whatever, because people are so on edge. And then with social media, people like are trying to get the word out and protect each other. But then you have this thing where like no one goes outside for 2 days, or kids don't go to school because people are all freaked out. There's just this panic, and I understand why. What I will say is the number of unaccompanied minors dropped after Trump was elected. Like if you look, so last year, a little over last fiscal year, which ended at the end of September, a little under 30,000 unaccompanied, or a little over, I think it was like 33,000 or something, unaccompanied minors came into the country, which of course was down from last year, where it was about 57,000. Also, remember, the historic annual average was 8,000. If you look at the month-by-month numbers, I think that's the most interesting. Like November, December, January, February, March were really low. Starting in like April or May, they started spiking again. And actually, if you compare, I always do a bad job explaining this, but if you compare the summer, like the month by month, so like June 2017 to June 2016, it was actually, even though the whole year was lower in 2017, June was like double what it was in 2016. So it's really hard to know, but it sort of seems like people were waiting around to see like what's going to happen, and then they started coming anyway. So the circumstances in El Salvador have not changed. The circumstances in Honduras have not changed, or not like measurably in any, you know, of course things are changing all the time, but like the fundamental circumstances have not changed. So people are continuing to come. And I saw in Mexico, just how many people are continuing to come. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it true that the U.S. has sort of paid Mexico in the last couple of years
Yes.
to close off the southern borders, and that's also part of the reason why fewer are coming through from the Northern Triangle?
That was especially true in 2015. So the numbers of unaccompanied minors dipped significantly in 2015, and that was those checkpoints I was talking about. That it was when I was down there in 2015. It was like I was with a French journalist, and it was like every time we got in our car, we'd be like, oh, the Marines checkpoint, the Inami, which is like the kind of like border patrol checkpoint. Like we'd have to the police check, but we had to go through checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint all the time. And the numbers of unaccompanied minors reaching the U.S. definitely dropped that year. It went from 60,000 the year before to around like 30,000 again. Still super high numbers. When I was down here before, when I was down there a couple of weeks ago, like none of those checkpoints were there. So what the Mexican government, I don't know, but what people have told me, I don't know for sure, but what people have told me is that the Mexican government was like, what is in this for us? This is like a lot of effort. And the fact is people were going around. So every time, and this is this thing with the wall, right? That like, okay, you can block off one route, but it's like a river, like that finds another flow. And so people, even in 2015, when I was down there, they were taking water routes. So they were going on these rickety boats in the middle of the ocean at night, in boats already loaded up with drugs. So it's just like danger, danger, and they were, and boats were being found, and boats were being washing up to shore. So they were going on the boats, or they were taking these. They weren't taking they weren't able to take the trains anymore. So they were taking these like really rugged mountain routes. But then people were like sort of bandits. They called them bandits. Bandits were hanging out and kind of like migrant profiteers, and so they were like robbing and raping people. So like the flows kept coming. So it seems like that effort is of course somewhat still there, but not anywhere like it was in 2015.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So you read this book. I read this book, and I know it's true, and it's facts, and it's vignettes, and it's deep reporting, but I felt like at the end it was like a novel, and I knew these kids, and I knew them from the time they were kids to, when they get jobs and they're adults, and so one thing is I was wondering how they're doing.
Yeah.
And their whole family through this book too, back in El Salvador, and their sister, and all this stuff. But I also wondered, what was their? Obviously, you had to do a lot of, talking to them, and so they're behind the book, right? They're not just sort of people that you met and blah blah blah, but they were part of this book, and I wondered. How do they feel and think about this book and the fact that it's finished, it's out there, and it has the potential of reaching many people and actually telling the truth of their situation?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. They're doing pretty well, actually. Like they're more rooted than they've ever been, which makes sense. It's been time, but their process was like this. They're for those who've read it. They're still living together. I actually don't want to give away one of them has a significant life event at the end of the book, and that significant life event is doing really well, and wink, that's all I'll say about that. But actually they have a stronger relationship now, especially Ernesto, who had a really tricky relationship with his older brother. They're much closer now, which is really cool and beautiful to see. And Ernesto has also graduated from high school, which I'm super proud about, and Raul is like this close and it's just a question of, honestly, I think it's a question of believing in himself to like go to adult school and do it because he can. So they're doing well. And the family back in El Salvador is, struggles up and down with the same stuff. It's like when these sort of rashes of violence, they actually, I should say, like live in a, relatively speaking, like safe place, part of El Salvador. But, like I'll get a call or get a Facebook message that like there was a shooting down the street or there was a shooting in the next town over and we're really scared and the guy's on the loose and we don't know where he is. So they're definitely spooked and scared. But they're at this moment, like they're doing okay. In terms of, they should get credit for writing. They deserve, they deserve as much credit. They wrote this book, right? Like they wrote this book through telling their story. And that's a really hard thing to do, and it's a really brave thing to do. It was also ethically complicated at the beginning. Like I feel totally fine about it now, but at the beginning it was like I thought that their story. I met them through the school that I work at, and that I tend to really keep my writing and that world separate. At the same time, I felt like this book was a really important book to tell, and I felt like their story, because there were two of them, and they had these really different, they were like, identical, but they had these really different experiences of their own experience, and like experiences of essentially the same experience, like they had different reactions to it. That was really important to me. I think we too often, especially with immigrants, tend to do this like, but in all sorts of journalism, that it's like this one character has to stand in for like the every Salvadoran kid immigrant, or like the every person from China who, like, and that never feels right. Like that doesn't feel fair. I wouldn't want someone to write about like my demographic and just put a one person stand in for everybody. So that was ethically complicated. Talking to them about, however, they were 18 by the time it sort of occurred to me. And I went down to El Salvador to ask their family's permission. I asked their permission, and it was understood the entire time that they would have the shield of anonymity of like getting pseudonyms. And they were actually really excited about the idea. They were like, "No, we think that this is important." This was during that summer when they were seeing the way that young people like them were being cast in the media as these hordes of kids crossing over, and there were all these like, they're bringing disease, they're bringing this, they're bringing that, and they were like, that was so horrifying to them. It's like, no, this story is wrong, and we kind of want to set the record straight. It's interesting. So they were really open to the project. The family was open to the project. I was surprised by the fact that they sort of seemed honored and almost perplexed that their story mattered in any way. Like, well, why us? Which again shows that they were like living their experience and didn't necessarily, because they were, of course, like we don't necessarily always think about how our experience fits into this like global phenomenon. I was nervous that once the book came out and was this physical entity, that they were going to be like, okay, no, never mind, like hold the presses, do over, take it back, we don't want to be a part of it. But it's really sweet. I've gotten texts and calls from them like, we saw the book in a bookstore. I was like, yeah, it's a real book. And I think because it's anonymous, I think they feel sort of like, this like secret famous, like, and they feel really proud. Like when I gave them copies of the book and even the galley copies, they were like really proud. So I hope that sticks. I definitely was nervous that it was going to feel too real once it was like a real book.
Did they get a sense, and other students also at
Yeah.
Oakland International, of that larger global story that you set this whole story in? Did the twins start to understand their own history in that way?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that actually just at Oakland International, like so many of the young people meeting other people in situations like theirs, like even, I talk about this in the book, but now there are all these amazing legal organizations and partnerships who have like not excellent, but like way better funding than they used to have, that they can take these cases. But in the book, I was like taking, 6 by 6, how many kids can I pack in my car? How many students can I take on BART to sit in the waiting room? And I'd like sit on the floor of these waiting rooms in San Francisco to see if these kids could get seen. And through that, so you're hanging out in BART with all these other kids who need lawyers. And I was actually thinking it was like through one another that they saw and understood the scope and magnitude of it. And then also, seeing in the news and really feeling kind of this call to arms of like, that's not right. Like, that's not that's not right. Like, this is not okay. Like the way that these children are being housed and treated, like not okay. And then also like, this is not correct. This doesn't feel like a fair categorization of why we're coming or who we are.
Going once.
Yeah.
You started out talking about how you started reporting on this, wrote an article, wrote another article, and then had to follow the story. I mean, or felt compelled in some way to follow the story, and came to this book. But I'm glad to see from what you're saying, you're still writing about the immigrants, and because it's so important. I mean, I haven't read the book, but listening to you, what you're bringing is a combination of a lot of compassion and heart and an analysis of you are setting it in a complex global framework, and the combination of that is very, very important and really compelling. But here's my question.
Thank you for that. That really means a lot. Thank you.
Well, that's really important. But my question is, what do you think of? You're painting an incredible horror story, right? Which is not ending, but intensifying, basically, right? I mean,
certainly not. Yeah, not going away.
I mean, it's not tailing off. I mean, that's what you're. It's not tailing off. It's not going away.
No.
So, what do you? I mean, I don't have a. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
What are we going to do? You know.
I do. So, I know. I thank you for that, because I've left some readings of people being like, "Well, that was horrible and depressing," and like, of course it is, and it should be. Although I hope it's like a call to arms in a certain way, and also I should say, like, the book, I think and I hope, has more optimism actually in like how these young people are like so incredibly strong and amazing and carry their lives and kind of their lives forward and transform these issues. So hopefully the book is not as although it is depressing, but it's not quite as somber as my talks, I think. I think that anytime you fight violence with violence, it's just a never-ending. I mean, the number of sort of conflicts that I mediate at school, right? It's like from the micro to the like this kid looked at me funny, and so then I said this to him, and then he said this to me, and it's like, then now all of a sudden we're throwing punches in math class, to the government of El Salvador instituting these mano dura campaigns to squash the gangs, which only has the gangs retaliate, which only makes the police retaliate, which is, on and on and on. Like, you can't fight violence with violence. It doesn't work that way. And I think that certainly in our immigration, in the context of immigration, we never look at the root causes. It's not something we talk about very much, or it's this throwaway thing of like, oh yeah, well that's El Salvador's problem. Like, why should we care about what's happening? Or like, okay, I care, I'm compassionate, but like we have to worry about the United States. And it's like, yeah, okay, sure, fine, but like it is our even compassion and humanity and human rights aside, like and sort of like global responsibility, like it is our problem because they're our neighbors and because they are coming across our border. So immigration is not this thing that happens, and I know we all know this, but like there's this, we talk about immigration as this thing that happens like the minute someone steps across that bright red line, and that's not true. Like, we have to trace it back. And I think the same, so in immigration, we rarely think about root causes and how to address them. And the same is true, I think, in El Salvador of violence. Like, I think a lot of people know what the root causes are. And what they really are is a lack of opportunity. And so I think any attempt to, just like people don't like take a life-threatening journey to the tune of thousands and thousands of dollars lightly and for no reason. Like, people don't join gangs for no reason, right? People join gangs out of either force or force of circumstances, like lack of other opportunities. There are currently 300,000 Salvadoran young people, so I think that's like below the age of 24, maybe 22, who are out of work or out of school. In a country of 6 million people, that is too many young people who are not engaged in something. So there's like unemployment issues, and kids only go to school for half the day in El Salvador. That's bad, right? They're not getting as much education as young people here are, as young people in many other places. So I actually really do think the issue is much more one of opportunity and about creating physical spaces for young people to learn and to thrive and to actually like put that into action, so that their options aren't like join a gang, hunker down and try to avoid a gang, or migrate to the United States. So, and I know that that's sort of like vague because I'm not like a development economist, but I definitely know that like education and work opportunities would go a very, very long way in curbing this problem.
Hi. The young girl in your second vignette and the dad who expressed worry for his beautiful daughter. Yeah. That made me wonder, do you know anything about like the fate that befalls like young women in El Salvador? And is there, do you see more men or women coming to the U.S.?
The United States, yeah. So the vast majority of people who are in gangs and the vast majority of people who are killed are men. Like over, I want to say, I actually don't want to give, it'll be incorrect, especially because this is being videotaped. The vast majority are men and are young men. The vast majority of people who are killed are young, and the vast majority are men. But I actually wrote an article that came out in September about young women who join gangs in El Salvador, and it's in this magazine called Pacific Standard. And El Salvador has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. So it's a gender-motivated killing, kind of being you're killed because you're a woman. For young women who are living in communities or who get involved in gangs, gang members and gang leaders reserve the right to claim any young woman in the town as their property and as their girlfriend. They can have up to many, many girlfriends. Young women who enter gangs are often initiated into the gang life by rape. And rape is sometimes an initiation tool or option, like that a young man can initiate himself by raping someone or by killing someone or by killing a woman. So the fate for young women is very bad. Also, the fate for young people in general is very bad, but there are these sort of like gender-specific kind of iterations of that badness and kind of that horror. That's a great question. Oh, and in terms of who's coming here, so actually, every year for the past few years, the numbers have creeped up of young women. It's like 68% or 70% are boys of unaccompanied minors, and then like 30 now, like 32, something like that, are girls. I actually think it might have been 34% last year. So like it's gone from like 29 to like 34. So not like an insane huge change, but more and more young women are coming. And I should say that on the road, the migrant trail is incredibly dangerous for women and for young women. And I know of almost every student I've talked to has taken birth control before coming, so that if she's raped or when she's raped, she won't get pregnant. And that's just someone in the book says this, it's just seen as a potential cost of going north.
Check. Thanks for coming.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
You have me right from the beginning with a description of those people being late for their appointment, and just like how,
ridiculous.
For most people, being late to an appointment is not that big of a deal, right? For them, their whole life was like hanging on the line as they watched the clock tower. But anyway,
ferry building.
And your writing is really it's amazing writing, for nonfiction and stuff,
Thanks.
But I guess my question is, I was just wondering about, like, my understanding, I haven't read the book, obviously, but it's about these young people end up in Oakland, right?
Yeah.
Or they're at your school.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about, like, the experience for these kids in Oakland versus, like, a place like LA or something where there's a lot more actual gang activity and I don't think that there's that much, like, for example, in Oakland. I know there's like norteños and stuff, but like what's their relation to all that? What's their experience like in Oakland?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Compared to like Chicago and to LA, Oakland definitely does not have the same kind of gang activity. Though Oakland does have some gang activity and certainly has a fair amount of community violence in certain communities. So I think a lot of our young people, and I also really, and so I should say, like, I really do not like the way that Oakland is often cast as this dangerous place. So I really appreciate the question as like couching Oakland as like this place of a ton of incredible resources and assets and community motivation. And there are dangerous things that happen, and especially like with the housing crunch, it's just caused like even more desperation. So there's definitely violence in Oakland. There is MS-13 activity in Oakland? I'm definitely not an expert at all on how that kind of looks and manifests in Oakland. I would say that a lot of my students, where they live, so like our students come from all over Oakland. Like we're in North Oakland just because like when we opened, that's where they had a campus. So that's where we are. But we pull from basically all the Oakland zip codes except for the hills. And students have to be careful about what they wear. Like they cross different gang territories, so they have to be careful, if they're wearing red in a particular place or blue in a particular place. And definitely a number of our students talk about feeling as though they're not like actively recruited in the same way that they are in El Salvador, but that like gang stuff is around and they know it and they feel it or they're aware of it or they've been told that, and so they just kind of like try to steer clear of it. I think a lot of students are surprised that like, wait a second, I came here to avoid MS-13 and there's gang violence here as well. I think some of the stuff that's in the book and that my students experience is just like being robbed or being jumped, which is something that can happen in cities. It's also when you have like the severe trauma of the nature that these young men have and that a lot of the students have, it just like it's like being robbed at gunpoint is scary for anybody. And if you had a severe trauma at gunpoint that had worse outcomes, like that's incredibly intense. So yeah, that's what I would say. But I would say that I actually think that a lot of my students have like intense Oakland pride, which is so awesome. Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah.
I did have one more question, but
go for it.
You want to have the last question?
Yeah.
I had another question too.
questions.
Sure.
Okay, I was just wondering what you think about Trump's comments about MS-13. He's like talking about they take this beautiful girl and
blood is pouring
and they slice her and they dice her. And,
totally.
It's really just like this it's kind of like those videos that he just posted like yesterday about
trying to cast everybody in this one horrible way.
I mean, knowing about the brutality of MS-13 and what they actually do, but at the same time, where that comes from, you're describing some of what causes people to join those gangs, and then at the same time how Trump's comments are actually part of painting all immigrants in this certain light. So
Yeah, exactly what you said. It feels like a total tool. It feels like a total tactic. Of course, MS-13 is a horrible organization. It's an organization, though, again, made up of like largely of young people. And so when like you have young people perpetrating intense violence against each other, like we don't treat child soldiers the way we treat gang members. Why not? Like, why don't we treat young gang members in the same way that we treat child soldiers? Child soldiers are victims. MS-13, a 15-year-old in MS-13 is a mass killer. That's a question that no one seems to be able to answer. And yeah, it just feels like a real tool. It feels like a real tactic to sort of cast all immigrants as MS-13 members or bringing it across our borders. Not true. That's just not happening. People are fleeing gangs. And it's also of note, and I wrote an op-ed about this fall, like to say, oh, these young immigrants are doing these horrible things when the reason we know that people join gangs out of lack of other options, like that's just not my theory. That is just true. That's like that's studied and proven. And that's true. Also, we should say, like the Italians, like the Irish, right? Like that's not just like brown young people coming across our border right now. Like, like disaffected young men, right? Like disaffected young men who are excluded and pushed to the margins of society end up in the shadows and end up in shadowy organizations. That is true all over the globe and throughout time. And so it is of note, right, that Trump is also eviscerating education, like eviscerating like this new tax code, right? Like all the things that they're doing are not helping, are not contributing to any of the interventions that would actually fix MS-13. It's just it's just fear rhetoric, right? So that's a huge bummer.
Okay, so this is a related question. There's an organization, Refuse Fascism, which has been trying to lead mass resistance to get in the streets to drive the regime from power. And we've done a lot of work outreaching among all strata, But in addition, actually in Southern California, but in addition to, immigrant people themselves, the DACA students, and in Pico Union, which is largely Central American. And the main thing that we're hearing is just that there's sheer terror.
Right.
But and I would like to understand that more, but also understand why at this point, when twofold, there's nothing to lose at this point, and the only way we're going to protect anybody is by driving this regime out.
Right.
That you can't find safety. They've pledged to deport all 11 million, let alone unleash mass ethnic cleansing and incarceration and detainment for immigrants. The only way to stop this is by stopping at least short term, is through sustained nonviolent resistance to prevent the consolidation of fascism. This is just, and maybe you don't have the answer or full answer, but given how courageous people have been in the struggle to just find basic survival, what do you think is holding people back from
taking to the streets?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great question. I'm sure everyone has their own. I mean, I know everyone would have their own answer, but I do think that it's like, I've done all of this to get here. The idea that I would make myself more visible and therefore be deported to all the things I struggled to leave behind, I think is just really terrifying to people. And so now I'm just going to ruin something in the book, but I think it's important. So the young man, Raul, who is in the book, who called me, he's like, he has a green card. He has a green card. And he's like, I hear they're taking papers away. And I'm like, they can't take your green, unless you're convicted of a crime or they can't take that away. And he just doesn't believe it. So even someone who has status and who should feel like, I mean, he could end up in the wrong place it's not a sure bet, but it's like, something that many people would give limbs to have a green card. He has that, but he's still so sure that at any minute, because he's had such horrendous things happen to him, and he just had there's this dark storm cloud of horrible luck following him around, that my sense is that he wouldn't take the streets because he's like, I'm going to protect that green card. I don't even believe that this green card is real because they could take it away from me at any moment. And certainly if I'm putting myself in any kind of vulnerable position, that's just too scary for me. And so I think that the level of insecurity is deeper than we can even suspect, because these things that I hold true, they can't take your green card away unless you're convicted of a crime. It's like, he's like, I'm not buying it. And you're the one who thought Trump wasn't going to be elected. So what the hell do you know? So I think that it's just this deep fear. But I think that's a really interesting and important question to be asking people. Or and not just why not, but what would the conditions be that would support you to feel safe to come out and demonstrate and use your voice in these ways? And your organization's doing amazing stuff. So very cool. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Such amazing questions, and thanks again for having me.